Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are having our What They Fought Against webinar today. My name is Ellie Fetzer. I am the manager of travel operations here at the National World War II Museum, and I am joined by our fantastic historian, Dr. Alexandra Richie, who is leading this tour among many others, and we're going to kind of dive into it a little bit more today. So, Alex, if you'd like to say a few words before we get started.
Well, yes, for those of you who haven't traveled with me before, my name's Alex Ritchie. I'm a professor of history full time, but also do a lot of work with the World War II Museum. One of the presidential counselors, help to plan the conference every year and just do as much as I can with the museum, which I love, 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 love. And including a number of tours. So the first one that I started doing was the rise and fall of Hitler's Germany, where we go from Berlin and travel through Poland, and then this one, which is what they fought against, which is sort of a deep dive into some of the things that you don't normally get to see as a traveler in this part of the world. And we really started coming, I think we were real pioneers in coming in, not just to Germany, Eastern Germany, but into Poland. And when I first started to come to Poland, back in the 80s, it was, still behind the Iron Curtain. Then the wall fell and, all that kind of stuff happened. And it was still quite difficult to visit and so on. And now Poland is just unbelievable. It's booming. There's so much tourism here. It's unbelievable to think. I remember even 6, 7 years ago, a few people would come visit Warsaw and you'd think, gosh, there's somebody from somewhere else coming to visit Warsaw. Now that's completely changed. It's one of the sort of hot spot tourist destination sites in Europe, and rightly so. It's just unbelievable. So this tour, of course, we start in Hamburg, which is again one of the most beautiful cities in Germany. It's got that waterfront, port town feeling to it. It's beautiful, very elegant, very lovely. Of course, with a very deep wartime history. And then we travel along the coast, which is very, very beautiful. We go in August, so there's a lot of time to sort of enjoy the beautiful weather and the beaches and these gorgeous, gorgeous hotels we stay in, and then end up in Warsaw, which is kind of known as the Phoenix City. It's just rebirth here is just unbelievable. I'm talking to you from Warsaw at the moment, which is where we'll have our final dinner at the end of the tour, a little manor house just outside of Warsaw.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So that is kind of the next couple of minutes that we're taking is really just kind of diving into more of these places that we're visiting on this program, which is relatively new. Like Alex had mentioned, this is, I believe, the fourth year that we're running this tour. And like Alex mentioned, we're going to be running it in August. So it's August 13th to the 24th. So we would love to have more of you join us for that tour because I had just been telling Alex right before we started, this is my favorite tour that we offer, hands down. So to me, it's super easy to talk about, but we'll kind of just take it day by day. As Alex mentioned, we are starting in Hamburg, one of my favorite cities that we visit on one of our tours. So I kind of wanted, Alex, if you could sort of talk about some of the highlights of Hamburg, what kind of stands out to you for touring that we do there.
Well, I mean, certainly Hamburg, as I mentioned before, is in and of itself just a beautiful city. We stay at a gorgeous hotel, Hotel Atlantic, which has an incredible history in and of itself because Hamburg was one of the most important port towns from which emigres from all over Central Europe, Germany, Poland, this later on Russia, and Central Europe generally left Hamburg to go to the United States. So a lot of people can trace their ancestry through people who went through Hamburg. And the Atlantic Hotel was one of the places that was built by one of the hotel magnates for all these people to come and stay. And therefore it shows a little bit of that sort of feeling about Hamburg, which is a very open city, very linked to the United States, very linked to the Atlantic. And and so that's part of it. And it's gorgeous. But of course, it also has its World War II history. And one of the most, I mean, infamous events in the war was Operation Gomorrah, which was the bombing of Hamburg. And this is very, very important because the bombing, of course, is a feature that runs throughout this whole tour. The bombing raids, the beginnings of them, the Germans beginning the bombing of civilian targets with Wielun on the Polish border, the siege of Warsaw, then Rotterdam, and then the Blitz and the bombing against London. And then, of course, the Western Allies, the Brits first, and then the Americans start to fight back. And one of the first attempts to fight back, as it were, was through Bomber Harris's idea that you could bomb Germany into submission by bombing the cities. And Operation Gomorrah was one of these operations, and Bomber Harris, who was the British Bomber Command head of Bomber Command, said this was one of the great successes because Hamburg was a basically very much a lot of wooden architecture, very old, and it created a firestorm. And so we talk about that, the implications of that. Why was it done? I mean, it's very, very important to be balanced about these things, to not say, oh, this terrible, terrible, or oh, of course it was great. No, why did it happen? Why was it done? What were the consequences of it? And then, of course, as I said, bombing is a huge theme that runs through this whole tour because we look at what the Germans then had to do all the way through the war to try and make up for the fact that all of these bombing raids were going on. Plus, we look also at the airmen who were downed and then were sent to prisoner of war camps, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in other words, it really, really melds into this. There's some other aspects of Hamburg which are tremendously important as well. One of the most important, I think, is looking at the terrible, terrible crimes that were committed by the Nazis. And this is reflected in Hamburg. We go to a medical museum there, which talks about, many of these sort of medical experiments. We go to the Bullenhuser Damm, where a number of children who were deliberately infected with a disease were then murdered by the Nazis toward the end of the war. I mean, it just touches on some of the truly horrific aspects of the Nazi regime. And the really important thing to remember all the way through is that, again, Hamburg's beautiful and everything else, but the Nazi regime was totally and 100% founded on violence and on criminality. And we touch on that very complex topic when we're in Hamburg from a number of the sites that we go and see.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, so something, Alex, that you talked about with it is, I mean, you're in the city center. We visit the St. Nicholas Church there, and you see the remnants of the bombings that occurred. So from there, when we're in the city, we kind of travel up north to Binz and to Kiel, Germany. Do you mind speaking a little bit more of some of the sites that we'll be seeing once we get up into northern Germany on the Baltic coast?
Yeah, well, we travel a little bit. Even when we're in Hamburg, we go to an amazing site called the Valentin Bunker, which was, again, something that Albert Speer was desperately trying to save the German war effort. And he came up with this idea of kind of almost like Henry Ford idea of putting pieces of submarines or U-boats together in this huge, huge, huge bunker. And we go and see this. It's incredible. We also go and see Neuengamme, which is one of the huge concentration camps, which was built. Hitler had this idea that he was going to choose 5 cities in Germany that were going to be representative, and Hamburg was one of them. Of course, the traditional building material of the North, that Hanseatic League, was brick. So he built this huge concentration camp called Neuengamme, first of all for the production of brick, and of course it then becomes one of these huge, huge sites. So we visit these places, but then we head up to an incredible site, the Kiel War Memorial, the Naval Memorial, where we also see the U-boat, the U-boat 995, which is sitting there still, and it is the U-boat in which Das Boot was filmed. And we watch when we're traveling. We try and make this. First of all, we stay in great hotels. We have fantastic food, great company, and so on. But we also try and watch films along the way. And one of them we watch is Das Boot, and it's so amazing to watch the film and then actually crawl through the U-boat. And when you actually go through it, I could barely get through. I mean, I'm getting old.
It's tiny.
It's tiny. You're sort of hanging from pipes and things, trying to get through. You make it through in the end, but it's just incredible to see it. So I find it just absolutely fascinating to go, and then you're up on the Baltic coast. And then really one of the top sites, I think one of the most important sites that we go and see is Peenemünde, because Peenemünde, of course, is the site where Werner von Braun, who later becomes so important in NASA and in the American Apollo effort, was, of course, cutting his teeth on creating rockets and so on for the Third Reich. And Peenemünde, of course, the V1, V2 rocket site. And a lot of it, of course, was destroyed in bombing raids, but there's still enough of it left. Some of the original buildings, particularly one of the original energy plants there. And it just gives a sense of how huge, how enormous this place was. One of the fun things is we actually go to Peenemünde by boat. We take a little boat that cuts a huge slice off driving, and it's really, really lovely. They put on a wonderful little lunch, and we sort of go around these wonderful little bays and so on, end up at Peenemünde, get off, and and go around this incredible site, which of course during the Third Reich you would never have been allowed anywhere near it. It's this huge, gigantic spit of land that was totally cut off. But then we go there. It really is very, very moving to see this place. Of course, once the bombing started happening on Peenemünde, the V2 rocket factory was moved underground to Dora Mittelbau, which was one of the sites of this terrible, one of the terrible camps where people were actually kept underground till they died working on these missiles. So, of course, on the one hand, it's scientifically amazing. Anybody's interested in aerospace or space travel or anything like that, it's an incredible site. On the other hand, of course, anything to do with Nazi Germany, there was always that flip side of criminality and violence.
Alex, something that you said too, because you're talking about Peenemünde, which is this massive structure, and I think that's kind of that key word that we use is these are mega structures. But of course, that involves a lot of slave labor. So do you mind touching on a little bit of just some of these sites that we see? They're these massive structures, but then also what the cost of, building these massive structures
Well,
is.
I mean, I mentioned Neuengamme, which was a concentration camp built to create the materials to build these sort of mega structures. The Valentine bunker, which was massive, and there's at the museum at the site there, there's a kind of commemoration of the slave laborers who were brought in from all over Europe to build the site, particularly French forced laborers who died. In their hundreds there. I mean, thousands of people died on these gigantic sites. Another place was, of course, Peenemünde, which is top secret, but Prora, which was this gigantic hotel that Hitler was building for his strength through joy tourists. And again, I mean, this was actually an early project, which was unlike the Valentine bunker. This was more like the Autobahns. These were built by Organization Todt to keep young German men employed right at the very beginning of the Third Reich. So these were kind of prestige projects that were set up by laborers who got a little bit of food and so on. That this was part of the Nazi program to get young men back to work. But that very quickly shifts to pretty well every one of these megastructure sites we see apart from Prora. Are sites which were built by slave laborers, and one has to remember the toll that of course that it took on all of these young men and women as well who were forced to labor in the over 40,000 camps and subcamps that were created by the Germans.
Mhm. And that's also too, for those of you, that is our visit to Valentine Bunker, as Alex mentioned, but we do that on our pre-tour. So we do have the main tour program of what they fought against, but we also have our pre-night tour that begins in Hamburg, and we drive out to Valentine Bunker, and you're able to see that massive structure. And something to note, and this is just sort of from going through this tour, but with Prora, it's amazing to see how these structures have evolved over time. You have Valentine Bunker has a part-time trailer park where people can park their RVs, and then you have with Prora, half of it, or so is still some new apartments that are being built in there. So it's interesting to see as you travel through just how these places are kind of being reimagined and reused after all this time.
Well, yes and no, because there's some places that we go to that nobody visits. And this is, I think, one of the things that's so special about this tour, because it's quite easy to, fly into Hamburg or fly into Warsaw nowadays. But we go to some of these places that are just extraordinary. One of them is the site of the V3. Wasn't actually a rocket, it was a jet propelled, like large series of pipes that were basically had sort of jet propulsion explosions that would send these projectiles, and they were set to target London. And we go to the place where this was invented because the V2 rocket was so expensive and they kept blowing up and so on. They didn't seem to be doing a very good job. And Hitler said he wanted more vengeance weapons, but he wanted them, they had to be much cheaper. And so they came up with this V3, which many people have never heard of. And we go to the actual hill, and you can see the concrete emplacements and some of these pipes and all these bits and pieces that have been found in the ground to this museum that's just run by one guy, in the middle of nowhere, and you walk up this hill and you see this one of these incredible sites that really nobody goes to visit. It's really amazing. And another one that I absolutely love is the equivalent to the Siegfried Line or the West Wall, which is called the Pomeranian Wall. This huge, huge complex of bunkers. Now, it's interesting because at the beginning of the war, Hitler was very into blitzkrieg, lightning war, war of movement, Bewegungskrieg. You just go in, you smash in, bring your tanks, you've got the Air Force coming in, and the Luftwaffe comes in, dive bombs everything. It's fantastically war of movement. But as Hitler starts to lose the war and the Red Army starts to push back, he seems to go back to this kind of World War One mentality. And one of the consequences of this is resurrecting something called the Pomeranian Wall. And these gigantic, massive bunkers, again built by slave labor, which are just unbelievable to see. We go and we see them. This whole we only see a tiny fraction of it, but we understand that this strings all the way along from the North Sea Baltic coast all the way down through to protect Germany, effectively protect Germany from the Red Army. This is Hitler and the Nazis scrambling to try and protect the Third Reich when they really start to realize that the Allies are closing in both from the east and from the west. Another thing that's fascinating that we go to again that nobody goes to. In fact, we've got these couple of young guys who stop their jobs in town and they come rushing out in their little cars and open the doors so we can get in. Of something called the Perlitz oil hydro work Perlitz. This is an incredible place. It was one of the largest synthetic fuel manufacturing sites in the Third Reich. And of course, why is this important? As I mentioned before, it all links to the bombing raids, it all links to the U-boat war, everything that we look at. The U-boat war, of course, very important in places like Kiel, where we look at where the U-boats came in during the happy times when the U-boats were killing the shipping between the North America and Britain. So all of that history comes into play. But another aspect of it was, of course, the air war and the bombing raids. And by destroying so much of the of the Nazi fuel capacity, the Germans had to come up with an alternative. And one of them was this Perlitz Works, incredible place, one of the largest industrial complexes in Nazi Germany, and of course designed to make synthetic fuel. And we get this, as I said, these young guys who just work locally, and they come and they open this up for us because this is not a tourist site. So this is one of the things that makes, I think, this tour so absolutely amazing, is we get to see these sorts of places that nobody else goes to visit. And they've, of course, found all sorts of things on the grounds and all sorts of stuff. Of course, again, it was the slave labor camps. They've got a section on the tremendously moving little trinkets and things they found on the grounds that people had probably when they died, in these terrible places. So it is an incredible place, and it talks again about the importance of the air war and how much of an effect it really was having on Albert Speer and his need to try and create both munitions and fuel and other materials for the Nazi war effort. And so we're looking at how we destroyed it from the air and through the war in the Atlantic, but also then how the Germans tried to fight back. And this fantastically interesting kind of cat and mouse game, which really forms the kind of backbone of the tour.
And at this point too, Alex, we are in Szczecin, in Poland. So we're making our way into Poland, which is something I do find. You had said not many people, of course, you visit, if you're in Poland, Warsaw, Krakow, but Szczecin, these places are just so obscure for most people. And for a lot of our travelers as well, who've, maybe you've done just more Western Europe, but now are going into Central Europe. So some of the sites that you see, as you mentioned, nobody is going to be able to make that easy train ride or flight over to go witness. So,
Well, and they're beautiful places. I mean, Szczecin itself is just won recently some amazing sort of European architectural prizes for amazing new buildings like the new symphony orchestra building. But we also stay in lovely places. And we stay in a hotel, for example, called Binz. And we're there for a couple of nights, which is nice. We can relax a little bit. It's right on the sea, beautiful sort of a boardwalk, fantastic food, great place. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that what I always try and do in during my tours is we always try and find a place where whoever wants to, it's not obligatory, but whoever wants to gather in the evening, after dinner, We can all sit around. Anybody's got any questions, or they want to talk about something that's interested them, or they've got questions about what's going to happen the next day, or they just, maybe they're a single traveler and they just want some company in the evening. So I always make sure that we have a place where we can meet. And Binz is one of those fantastic places because it's got this gorgeous room with very comfortable chairs, and you're overlooking the ocean or the Baltic Sea, and we can sit and talk and discuss what we've seen or what we're going to see the next day. It's absolutely lovely, and I think it's so important because it's one of the things that breaks down barriers very quickly between people. They might not know each other, and all of a sudden they're brought together by this interest in this history. And again, because we're going to such obscure places, of course you'll find people who are experts in the U-boat war. They're experts in they've had a family member who, for example, was in a POW camp, and they'll know all about that aspect of history or whatever. But to put it all together is so much fun and so exciting. And you find that, people have snippets of information or something they've seen or something they've read a lot about, but then they won't know anything about, the Politz synthetic fuel manufacturer or whatever. And that's what makes it so much fun. And people really get into it. And it's just a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And it's to me, it always seems true too, because of how many friendships kind of have developed out of these tours and how many people have, been on what they fought against. And now they want to do rise and fall. But like you said too, of just having different backgrounds. And this is the reason what attracted you to this tour. It's always interesting to have these discussions in that evening to be able to kind of learn more about people and kind of fill in those gaps, maybe where people have maybe less knowledge or so. And never, when they're on this tour, they could just expand that even more so. Um, I
Exactly.
did.
And sorry, I was just going to say that of course the focus is all World War II, and this is really the sort of DNA of the tour, of course. But we also take the time to look at other things. They're beautiful, as I said, architectural, or the geography of the place is absolutely stunning. I mean, Hitler didn't put his Kraft durch Freude gorgeous hotel right on the Baltic coast for no reason at all. I mean, it's absolutely stunning, and it's great to walk on the beach. And we go to Torun just very briefly
Mhm.
for lunch. Torun's one of the most beautiful cities in Central Europe,
Mhm.
an old Hanseatic city for example, Copernicus taught there for a great portion of his life. Beautiful sort of brick, like gingerbread house. In fact, they make gingerbread there. It's their
Right.
sort of staple product. But it's absolutely stunning, and because it was so small and sort of unimportant in the 18th, 19th century, it was kind of forgotten about. And so it's really kept its Renaissance architecture. And then it was thankfully spared during World War II because so many cities were destroyed, rolled over by the Germans or the Russians. But it's one of those places that's kept its beauty. And so we have a gorgeous lunch there. We can walk around the city and actually get a sense of what these places would have looked like before. But another thing that's very, very close and tremendously moving and very, very important to our tour is going to Schuben and Oflag 64. And this is the largest American POW camp in Nazi Germany and certainly in Poland. Now, what is now today Poland? Huge number of airmen who were shot down over. Even in Western Europe, and they're shot down in France or wherever, and they were moved to Schuben because it was out of the way. It was a little bit like Stalag Luft 3, where the Great Escape happened. It was one of these places that was out of the way. It was easy for the Germans to control and protect and keep the prisoners from escaping if possible. So this place is amazing because they've got a small museum there with many, many documents, diaries, handmade chess sets, musical instruments, all of these letters that people wrote, and so much of that is there. And because it's, again, not one of these sort of everything's behind glass museums where you sort of walk in, you have to be very formal. Everything's sort of out on tables. You can kind of take a look at it and go, oh my goodness, the silk scarves that were smuggled into the camp with maps on them, for example, all this kind of thing. It's just mind-blowing what's there. And yet it's got this very human feeling because you're in the buildings that they were in. And it's just an amazing place. So we go there as well. And again, this is a nod to the huge contribution that was made by the airmen as they were shot down over Europe. and how they were treated and what happened to them. And of course, there's a commemoration also of the death march that took place from Oflag 64. Like so many of these camps, the Nazis wanted to move prisoners, both prisoners from the extermination camps, from death camps, from concentration camps, from slave labor camps, but also prisoner of war camps, to move them into the Reich. We don't know why. They were different reasons for different camps, but perhaps to hold prisoners as hostages of some kind or whatever. And these men were forced in the darkest depths of winter with no protection, no shelter, forced to march westward into Germany proper. And so we talk about that as well, and this sort of huge sacrifices that were made by many Americans and other Allied prisoners of war as they faced these terrible conditions toward the end of the war. Because during the war themselves, Allied POWs, Western Allied POWs, were generally speaking treated relatively well by the rules, let's put it that way. I mean, certainly it was a horrible thing to be in a POW camp, but they were more or less treated well. But these death marches were something very different, and many men perished from illness, disease, starvation, and so on these marches.
And something special that we do on all of our tours, but I think that's a really, special way to honor the memory of those is that we do a wreath laying with the National World War II Museum, and we'll have, a guest or so will lay that wreath for that for the memorial there. And something too interesting that I just adore that museum because each year I know it's getting bigger and bigger, the one that we see at Oflag 64. So I'm hoping that this year, that it's just even a little bit, bigger. They have more resources and everything because the artifacts that they have are just quite amazing. And especially too, you have a baseball bat, but then you'll have those items where people just are, creative of when they're in a terrible situation, just what kind of comes out of that is quite amazing.
Yeah, and they're trying to really link to, or all the prisoners. So anybody, if you have any relatives, because so many people who come on the tours, of course, have some sort of, father, uncle, grandfather, who was a prisoner of war in Europe, and sometimes they were in Oflag 64, and this is tremendously moving, of course. So if any of you have think, oh gosh, maybe I heard about, maybe granddad was a prisoner of war in somewhere over there. Look it up if you can, because they have now the records of people who were there, and it's so amazing if you find somebody who's linked, and of course the prisoner got home, and then they maybe had some letters or something like that from the camp, because it's it just ties us to the American story. I mean, one of the things that I always try and emphasize is that this isn't the Normandy landings where we put boots on the ground in Normandy per se, and yet it's still very, very much part of the American story. I mentioned at the very beginning all of the people from the 19th century and early 20th century who left Hamburg to come to the United States. A lot of people can trace their heritage back to this part of Europe. And obviously Holocaust history and heritage as well. People who've got Jewish heritage from this part of the world, people who were airmen and flew over Europe, people who were involved in the Atlantic War. I mean, there's so many ways in which this part of the world was also part of the American story. Maybe not as obviously as the Normandy landings were, but it's still very, very linked. And you really feel that when you're at Oflag 64. We lay a wreath to there's a little memorial there. Also, an interesting memorial because two of the men that were prisoners there were illegally taken by the Nazis to be witnesses to the exhumation of the prisoners who were found shot by Stalin at Katyn. It was Katyn massacre. When Stalin took over his part of Poland, they took 20,000 plus officers in uniform, and Stalin murdered them. He thought, of course, nobody would ever find them, so their graves were out there. Then, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, the Nazis found these graves, and they made a big, huge, Goebbels made a big, huge propaganda thing out of this. And they took illegally, completely illegally, these two American prisoners to force them to be witnesses to the exhumation of these bodies. And that's mentioned on this memorial as well. And I mention this because when we go to Warsaw, we go to a tremendously moving little museum which commemorates the Katyn massacre. So again, this is all linked together in some way.
Right, right. Because from whenever we are leaving, we stay in a tiny town called Bydgoszcz and move our way into Warsaw. We'll have 3 nights there, and that is one of the museums that we do start with touring. But I know, of course, I mean the expert on Warsaw is you, Alex. So if you want to kind of talk about, I know you're speaking from Warsaw right now. So some of the sites that we see in Warsaw, it's an incredible city. You had mentioned, it's a Phoenix city. So if you would kind of
Yes.
like to speak on some of those.
Well, the first, just on our way in, we stop at a place called the Explosium, which is again coming back to this idea of how did the Nazis try and deal with the fact that they were being bombed? Well, one of the things they did was they kept moving factories and munition plants and so on further and further east. The Explosium is one of the largest munitions manufacturing centers of Nazi Germany. And we go there. It's now just been turned into a small museum. Again, we only see a tiny fraction of the site. I remember I once did a National Geographic film there we covered this huge site, which seemed to take days just to go around the perimeter of it, finding all these buildings and everything, but just a massive, massive munitions manufacturing site where you can see how they had to deal with, building, and this is all still in place, building, slanted roofs and floors and windows that would explode outwards if there was an accident and all these things. So we go to this place, and then on our way into Warsaw, we also stop in my mind, one of it's to me the true depth of hell, which is Treblinka extermination camp. And most people have heard of Auschwitz. And many people, of course, the more people were murdered at Auschwitz. Over 1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz over the course of its existence, which was from 1939 until 1945. But Treblinka, almost as many people were murdered there, about 900,000, but it was only in the space of just over a year. And the mass murder of people at Treblinka was only the Jews in one of these extermination sites. In Auschwitz, there were people from all over Europe. There were mostly Jews, but also non-Jews. There were people who were kept alive working in labor camps and so on. Treblinka was only an extermination camp, the largest of the so-called Reinhard camps. So we go there, and what's absolutely shocking is not only how the industrial scale of the mass murder that takes place there. As I said, over 900,000 people in just over a year. It's mind-boggling what they did, but also the cynicism. They had a fake railway station with
Mhm.
flower boxes and a fake clock and all this kind of stuff to lull the victims into thinking that they were just going to a normal train station, have a bit of a rest. And of course, this was this operation of murder, and it really shows the cynicism, the depth of evil to which the Nazi system degenerated during its existence. And that's one of the things we stop in at Treblinka, and it's truly, truly well, it's eye-opening because unless you've really studied the Shoah, the Holocaust, it's something you perhaps haven't heard about, and to actually witness this place is something, I mean, truly chilling. Then we go into Warsaw itself, and we stay in one of the most beautiful hotels in Central Europe. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous, the Bristol Hotel. And one of the things we do when we arrive that Sarah organized is to have a really beautiful Chopin concert. And one of the reasons is we first of all been on this incredible journey, this sort of maelstrom journey, but also just come from one of the, as I said, one of the most terrible places on earth. And in a way, listening to Chopin is this tremendous depth of this love of Poland, Polish culture, Polish heritage, what the Poles were fighting against, what it meant to the Poles to resist Nazism, and places like Treblinka as well, and so on, and the depth of that feeling. I think it sort of pours out when we listen to this amazing concert. And then when we're in Warsaw, as you mentioned, it is the Phoenix City. I mean, it's unrecognizable from the place that I first came to in the 80s, where there were still big, huge bombed out patches and or sort of Stalinist architecture, and then the sort of communist era, cheaper kind of prefab architecture. And then in the 1990s, with the collapse of communism, all of a sudden, private enterprise started coming in, building hotels and sky rises and office buildings. And now it's just this youthful, vibrant, thriving city, incredible place. And you really feel that energy. And so in some ways, you really have to look for the history, the remnants of the ghetto wall, for example, or some of these museums. So we do go to the Katyn Museum, as I mentioned before, one of the most really moving museums of the personal belongings of those those brave men who were simply massacred. And of course, it's just not okay to take soldiers, officers in uniform, and imprison them and then kill them. It's just not okay under any rules of warfare. But of course, this is what Stalin did. And so this museum commemorates them. We also go to a really very interesting museum, which is called Mokotow Prison, which was a prison during the Nazi period and then just transformed again right into a Soviet prison. So some of you know me already and you've met me and you've met my family, but some of you haven't. And my husband's Władysław Bartoszewski, his father was a very well-known, he too was actually in Auschwitz. He was a Polish Catholic, was in Auschwitz. And then was one of the very few people was released, became an activist to try and help save Jews during the war, was in the Warsaw Uprising, and then immediately after the war was put into Stalinist prison for 7 years. So he was in Mokotow prison. And my husband, his son, takes us through Mokotow prison and shows us some of the places where he was kept. It's again very moving. My husband is now Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in Poland. So when we then have our private dinner at my house outside of Warsaw, he's absolutely loves talking to people and having these tours. And so it's kind of Chatham House rules where no holds barred. He'll talk to everybody about everything as long as everybody keeps their mobile phones turned off and talk about the situation of Poland's place both during the war, but also how Poland has changed during the last decades and what's happening in the world today. And there's so many interesting questions because, of course, World War II history very much links into the present and into the future. And history doesn't just stop in 1945. It carries on in so many different layered ways. And again, that's one of the themes of the tour, not to talk about contemporary history per se, but to look at the roots of the things that are happening all around the world today in those things that happened in this part of the world between 1939 and 1945. So it's a fascinating tour. And I just love ending in Warsaw because, as I said, not only is it full of incredibly moving World War II sites, we don't even begin to sort of touch the surface of what people get to see. And by the way, I always say if people want to stay on longer and want to see more things, they want to have stay on, please let me know. And I'm very happy to help organize things for people who maybe they want to explore their family history. Maybe they've got some relatives who came from Warsaw or whatever. Maybe there's some museums that we just didn't have time to see. Maybe there's some cultural or other things outside of Warsaw that you want to see. But I'm very happy to help set those things up.
And absolutely, because as you said, there's never enough time. I feel that's what we hear most on the tour. We just didn't have enough time.
Yeah, I
And
know.
that's, of course, that kind of, leads into why we've created this whole new tour of what they fought against. Because we do have our Rise and Fall program that's been operating for many years now and is such an amazing tour in and of itself, that one starting in Berlin, ending in Warsaw. So you are going back to Warsaw with that tour, but it is very different, as you had mentioned, Alex, that you do different things on each tour, which kind of leads me into asking just a few questions about Rise and Fall. I wanted to touch on while we're here, but just what are some of because I know we do have a lot of people that typically ask, should I start with Rise and Fall? Should I start with what they fought against? So kind of just an idea of how those two tours differ to you.
Well, they differ. They complement one another, I would say. I mean, the in what they fought against, we start in Hamburg. In Rise and Fall, we start in Berlin, and I think in what they fought against is much more. There are many more links in a way to particularly the American, the British fight against what the Germans were doing, against Nazism, against their industrial might, and so on. The rise and fall of Hitler's Germany is very much more looking at the ideology that fueled Hitler's rise to power. It's centered, starts in Berlin, the Olympic Games, propaganda, Goebbels' propaganda ministry, Hermann Goering, the topography of terror, which is the seat of, I mean, of course, now it's a ruin. It's now a museum, a documentation center. But it was back in the day the head of the SS, the Gestapo, the Sicherheitsdienst, this sort of whole apparatus of terror. We go past Tiergartenstrasse 4, the T4 program, where the euthanasia program started, which was the precursor to the Holocaust. We see, for example, track 17, which shows the way in which the Jews from Berlin were simply deported from, in front of their neighbors' eyes and sent to this railway station and then deported to places like Riga ghetto or Vilnius or later on to Auschwitz and so on. And so we talk about that history, that sort of setting up of this apparatus of terror. We then go also to into Poland, into Stalag Luft 3, for example, again, one of the very, very famous prisoner of war camps, which was made famous by the film The Great Escape. We go to an incredibly interesting town, Wrocław, which used to be Breslau. One of the last huge, huge battles of World War II in Europe took place there because the Gauleiter refused to surrender, even though Hitler was already dead. He kept fighting on. So Breslau, of course, was practically all destroyed. We go there. It's a fantastic, beautiful little town, completely restored. We go to a small museum there, which actually is in memory of my father-in-law, and talk about again that whole history of resistance in World War II in Poland. And then we go on to Krakow. Krakow is one of the most beautiful cities in Central Europe, which, of course, for anybody who's interested in architecture and history, it's stunningly beautiful. Of course, we never have enough time there. We stay at a hotel which is very close to the city centre, so people can spend the evening walking, having a meal, or whatever else. But we also use that opportunity to go to Auschwitz, which is again a tremendously moving and deeply unsettling experience. And then we take the train from Krakow and we go on this very sort of lovely journey through the Polish countryside, through what was the Polish corridor. So again, we're talking from the perspective of Hitler and Nazi Germany. Hitler, one of his sort of great mantras at the beginning of the war was to retake what he called Lebensraum, but also to retake territory that he thought had been unjustifiably taken by the Treaty of Versailles. And one of these was the Polish corridor, which had allowed Poland access to the sea, also the free city of Danzig, now Gdansk. So we traveled, take this train up the Polish corridor, which is fascinating, end up in Sopot, which is a beautiful town, one of the most gorgeous hotels where Hitler stayed when he was invading Poland. We go to Gdansk, which has been beautifully, meticulously restored, stunningly beautiful city, and see Westerplatte, where the first official shots of World War II began. Certainly the European war. People can talk about whether the war began earlier in China or whatever, but if you're talking like the official date of the start of World War II, it's generally 1st of September 1939, and that's at 4 o'clock in the morning shots from in Westerplatte from the ship that was moored there. And then we go through Gdansk and that area. We go to the Wolf's Lair, which was Hitler's incredible headquarters out in what used to be East Prussia, this dingy, dark, dank place where people don't realize he spent over 800 days of the war there, not in Berchtesgaden, not in Berlin, but up there. And I think when you go, you get this sense of his psychological sort of, this miserable place. I mean, this sort of closing, the woods and the mosquitoes kind of closing in on you. And then we go to Warsaw, but we see very, very different things in Warsaw from on both tours. And as I said, there's certainly no shortage of things to see in Warsaw. I mean, there's new museums like, opening all the time. There's just so much interest in not just World War II history, just the history of the region, generally speaking, but we do go to a number of places. For example, the Polin Museum, which is the history of Polish Jewish history, which won the European Museum of the Year a few years ago. It's a stunning museum, and a number of other places, including the Jewish Cemetery, and follow the story of the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is again tremendously moving. So there's so many layers that we touch upon in Warsaw on both of these different tours. And as I said, if anybody wants to stay on after any of these tours to see some of those things that we just don't have time for, because as you said, the complaint I hear most often is, why can't we have another day in fill in the blank? Why can't we stay
Right.
in bins longer? Why can't we go? And I feel absolutely feel the same way. I just love to do that. But anyway, it's possible to do that on your own afterwards.
Right. And it's actually wonderful. I kind of wanted to talk about one thing before, but I almost just feel like I have to go into it is that, like you said, I mean, we do have that, that we want more time here. And so I think that's a perfect segue into our new tour that we're operating in 2027, which is called From the Rubble. This is 4 nights in Krakow and 3 nights in Warsaw. In Warsaw, we're staying at the Hotel Bristol, like Alex mentioned. It's a stunning hotel. And in Krakow, we'll be at the Hotel Saski, which is just a very different tour that we're doing, or I should say, kind of complements everything too, because you have more cultural, more sort of that emphasis on architecture, and it just brings in a lot of different aspects of Polish, history and culture. Alex, did you want to talk some of the highlights that we're going to be doing on this tour?
Well, yes, what I wanted to, well, I mean, one of the things that we do, we're the, the two tours that I've just mentioned are really, really, absolutely World War II focused, and we're really, as I said, especially what they fought against, we go to places that nobody gets to see, and we really go into depth into the air war and into the POW camps and the whole system. And sometimes there are people who just love all of this stuff like me. I could talk about this till the cows come home, and as I do. But there are also so many other aspects of war and many aspects which are to do with personal experiences, to do with art, culture, destruction, rebuilding, to do with how do people cope simply when something like this happens? All of a sudden you're living your life, and all of a sudden your city is surrounded, and you're a refugee, or you're bombed out of your home, and so on. And how do you deal with the cultural treasures? How do you rebuild things? How do you protect them? And so in a way we've tried to build this into this tour, and also make it in a way, I wouldn't say more joyful, but in a way, more of that sort of richness of the things that did survive, the things that are so precious to us now, and also a lot less traveling. So going between Krakow and Warsaw is very, very easy. And although I love the travel, and we cover so much ground, and we see amazing things like the seaside, and Hitler's wolf's lair and all these amazing places, they're hard to get to. So that's a lot of travel with the other tours. But this one is just a lot gentler. So for people who perhaps don't move about, or don't travel quite so well, they just don't want to be moving every couple of days. This is lovely because you stay in one of the prettiest hotels in Krakow, right in the city center. You literally walk out the door and you can't help but fall over one of the most beautiful sort of architectural gems here, there, the other. We're right next door to the Czartoryski Museum, which is Czartoryski is still one of the great families of Poland, and back in the Renaissance period, and later, well, some of the greatest landowners in Poland, and had a huge wealth, and they had a vast, vast private collection of paintings, sculptures, and so on. And the Czartoryski Museum is, in a sense, what survived the war, what was returned after the war. And some of the most famous paintings include the Lady with an Ermine. This is one of the great Leonardo da Vinci portraits, and it's absolutely beautiful. I can stand in front of it for hours, and we get a tour of the painting. And interestingly, of course, all these things are linked to World War II. So Hans Frank, who became the governor of the general government, he put himself into the Wawel Castle, which is this beautiful, beautiful castle complex, one of the great symbols of Polish national identity. And he stole the Lady with the Ermine and a whole bunch of other paintings and tapestries and all these other things, and stuck them in his, for example, the Lady with the Ermine went in his bedroom. And I know his son, Nicholas Frank, who complained he hated that painting because his father, Hans Frank, would always make him sort of put his hair down, like plaster to his head, because he said, "Oh, you should look like the lady and the Lady with the Ermine, and have her hair done like this." He hated the painting, but it was so bizarre. Of course, when the war was ending, Hans Frank took the painting and tried to escape with it to Germany, and many other art treasures as well. And some of those paintings were lost. Some of them still haven't been found. But thankfully, the Lady with the Ermine and some of the others were found, returned in 1950s. Some were returned from the Soviet Union. And so it's really a gorgeous, gorgeous museum, with this, of course, as its centerpiece. And there's so many other things like this in Krakow. I mean, just anybody who wants to take the evening and wander around, not just museums, but even going into some of the old churches, dating from the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century, just this whole cavalcade of architecture. Also very interesting and important stories. For example, John Paul II, his whole history was so much based in Krakow. And then we take the journey to on the way to Warsaw. We stop in Kielce, which is a very interesting small town, it's a typical small town in Poland. But it was a place again which talks about this very complex relationship between Poles and Polish Jewish history, because there was a massacre that took place there in which Poles participated against Jewish citizens. So we talk about that, the complexities. Why did this happen? What were the reasons for this? Then we travel into Warsaw, and again, so much of this tour has to do with the cultural legacy, architectural legacy, the history of Chopin, who was so important in that whole spiritual and cultural history of Poland. Talk about his history, go to the Chopin Museum, go to the Warsaw Castle, where the most amazing Canaletto paintings are. And again, this links to World War II, because during World War II, Warsaw was completely flattened. And in order to rebuild the city, they took these glorious Canaletto paintings and rebuilt the old town using this huge series of paintings to get the colors right, to get the architecture right, to get the dimensions and proportions of the buildings right. And so the old town of Warsaw is the only old town in the world that's a UNESCO World Heritage Site that's been rebuilt. Everywhere else in the world is, original, ruins perhaps, or original, monuments or pyramids or whatever. This has actually been rebuilt, and it's stunningly beautiful. And again, our hotel is just right down the road. So there's this huge depth, these museums and places that we don't go onto the other tours. For example, into the Warsaw Castle with this enormously beautiful heritage. But of course, the Warsaw Castle itself was rebuilt, brick by brick, and it was one of the last buildings rebuilt because the communists also didn't want the Warsaw Castle to be rebuilt after the war, because it was also seen as a symbol of Polish national identity. And of course, neither Hitler nor Stalin wanted Polish national identity to get in their way of ruling that part of the world. So there's so many layers, and it's absolutely stunningly beautiful, and a very, very moving, I would say more gentle tour with many more facets into, of course, World War II history, World War II legacy, but also touching on some of those other aspects that we, rather than just the sort of guns and ammo stuff, we also look at
Right.
the other
You get the
aspects
arts as
of
well.
war as well. It combines both, of course.
Right,
You can't
right.
go on a tour with me without not having the technological side as well, and the wartime side, but then we touch on some of the other things as well. So it makes it maybe for people who are interested in everything from music, fashion
Right.
to architecture to paintings to the monuments men, for example, what work they did to try and save these monuments, these cultural treasures, and the American input for this was so important, and it still is actually to this day. So it's something we talk about, and we'll have a conversation with somebody who works with the Monuments Men um, uh, organization here in Poland.
Right. And being able to have sort of that, private experience as well, as I think that's something so amazing about these tours, because you really do travel as if you are just one group. We have when we visit the Czartoryski, I apologize ahead of time too to
It's
all of you.
perfect. That was perfect. That was
I'm working
perfect.
on my Polish, but no, we have that private viewing of a Da Vinci painting, Lady with an Ermine. So it's amazing how many sites that we get to see. I know we're going to the UNESCO heritage site, the salt mines that we are going to see on that tour as well. Going to Schindler's factory and visiting his office, something that we see on Rise and Fall, but we're going to go into more depth. So it's just amazing that all of these tours, like you said so well, Alex, that they do complement each other. So if you've been on one tour, want to go more in depth, we just have such an amazing collection. And Poland is my favorite, place in Europe that we visit. It's just such a special place. And it's so wonderful that we get to share that with you as well, with being there, knowing Poland in and out and just seeing how amazing of a country it is. And I'm so happy to have more opportunities for our guests to travel and visit.
Yeah, and it's true that when you mention things like I've forgotten about the salt mines. I mean, it sounds like, oh, you go to a salt mine. No, this is not going to a salt mine. This is going to one of the most amazing, it's like underground It is like something out of a Disney movie. It's these room after room after room, just huge, like palaces, all carved out of crystal, so it all shines in the candlelight. It's just unbelievable. And of course, during the war, again, there were some of these areas that were used to produce armaments and so on, because of course it was underground, and there were also experiments done there because the quality of the air and the stillness of the air and the humidity and so on was controlled. But actually, to go down there now is so, so beautiful. There's sort of palatial room after palatial room carved into the rock with all these ornate and beautiful, candelabras and niches and statues. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It's like it's breathtaking. And as you said, when we are on Rise and Fall, because we don't have time, we don't go into the Schindler's factory itself, but there it is. And so we get to go inside in this particular tour and see the enamel, where the enamel factory was producing the enamelware that saved so many people's lives indirectly because of Schindler's creating the list and saving people. So there are all of these sort of different things that, of course, touch on the war, but also add a different sort of aspect as well.
Mhm. And I know that our tour manager, Barbara Bieniek, is always happy when we spend more time in Krakow as well. So I know she's
Yeah.
super excited about this tour.
Yeah, no, we have a very friendly rivalry because I live in Warsaw and she lives in Krakow. And I mean, I'm with her on this one. Krakow is truly one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. And again, these places, because they were behind the Iron Curtain, they weren't really discovered. Again, when I first went to Krakow, things were falling apart, they were crumbling, nothing was painted. It was pretty depressing. Same with, those, if any of you have been to Prague or Budapest, the same thing. And now, of course, they're just stunningly beautiful and really, really worth visiting. If you've got any interest in cultural history, architectural history, all of those things are stunningly beautiful. And yeah, I have to admit, despite my love of Warsaw, and I would only live in Warsaw, but Krakow is much more beautiful in the traditional sense of the word.
In the
I
traditional,
have to.
but you always can tell we can always let our guests, make their own decision from just coming on one of our tours and hopefully being able to decide that for themselves. So
That's
we do
true.
hope that you all join us. I did want to mention, so that date from the Rubble, which is Krakow and Warsaw, is April 24th to May 1st of 2027. So next spring. But we do have our August 13th to 24th of this year are what they fought against tours. And then we also offer Rise and Fall throughout the year. So please, if you have any interest in these tours or want to know more, feel free just to reach out to us. We're always happy to help. Just get you over to Poland to see some of these spectacular sites and learn more about the history and the culture there. Alex, I want to say a big thank you for being with us today and joining us for this webinar. And I'm hoping that we have many more travelers coming out of this.
Well, it's such a pleasure. And as I said, really the most important, the most wonderful thing I find is that, you can start a tour with people you've never met before or whatever. And by the end of it, precisely because we try and have these discussions, meetings, talks, dinners, lunches together, you really get to know one another and everybody's welcome. That's the thing. It's that, it doesn't matter what your views are, if you're a single traveler, if you're traveling in a small group, whatever, it's this sense of we're all looking at these things together. And most of you have never been to a Pulitz, synthetic fuel factory or a V3 site because they're just hard to get to. So when we go to these places, it really is amazing. And people go, oh my goodness, no idea. It's exciting and it's fun. And then we get a chance to, as I said, relax with gorgeous food, beautiful hotels, lovely scenery, and all those nice things too.
Yes, absolutely. So we will go ahead and finish the Zoom there. I know that it's 1 p.m., so perfect timing. But I hope that those of you that are interested would like to join our tours. If you have any, questions, of course, feel free just to reach out. But we look forward to seeing you on tour.
I
Thank
just
you so
wanted
much,
just
Alex.
one little tiny shout out is that the new Tom Hanks World War II movie is coming out soon, and the World War II
Yes.
historians, a lot of World War II historians, including yours truly, are in it. It's coming out on Memorial Day. So if you're interested in some of the background of what happened in Central Eastern Europe, is really what I'm talking about in that film. So by all means, keep an eye out for it. And there are lots and lots of other World War II museum historians who are involved in it too. So that's
And that's
so
going on the reading list.
yeah, yeah, on the reading list.
That'll be
Your
there.
homework.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. See you
Have a
soon,
good day.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.